If then it isn't broken, why fix it? The fervor to limit terms of elected officials has swept across this nation in the last 10 years. The Oregonian recently reported that the U.S. Term Limits Advocacy Group based in Washington, D.C. has counted successes among 28% of municipalities, 20 state legislative races, and 40 governor's offices throughout the nation. You may recall that Oregon voters voted in 1992 to limit state and congressional terms. Following that, this past year, the U.S. Supreme Court has decided that states cannot impose limits on federal congressional terms. Our speakers today, seated at head table, have been leaders on opposite sides of this issue. Each has damned his opponent with faint praise. Paul Farago is a proponent of term limitations. Mr. Farago is a founding member of U.S. Term Limits and heads the Vote Yes on Portland Term Limits campaign. He's a leading national figure and a strategist for the term limits movement. Farago's measure in Portland has been termed by his opponent, and I'm quoting, flawed and irrelevant, attractive for the disaffected and the uninformed. And since Mr. Farago is a relative newcomer to Portland, Dr. MacColl has characterized him as a nice, bright young man who doesn't know about Portland's government, history, or operation. On the other hand, Kimbark MacColl is a long-noted Portland historian, an author, and the treasurer of the No on 2639 Committee. MacColl has been involved in Oregon and perhaps more significantly, Portland's civic affairs for over 30 years, serving among them Governor Tom MacColl, no relation, and Mayor Neil Goldschmidt. Dr. MacColl has been described by Mr. Farago as, and I'm quoting, a nice man who probably knows more about Portland's history than anyone, but someone who does not know much about term limits. So we are about to hear a debate between these two nice men who will present their perspectives to us in a debate format, after which, if we have a quorum, we will call for a vote of the membership on our study committee's research report. Seated to my far right at the head table, as I mentioned when Charlie asked his question, is another former president of the City Club, Jim Westwood, who will serve as our parliamentarian in that report vote. And now I will turn the program over to Bill Lesh, a former City Club president who has served as a member of the Research Board, as a member of the Board of Governors, and on several city, county, civic study committees. He is currently conducting his own business, W.R. Lesh Company, consulting with corporations on corporate strategies and public relations. Bill?
Thank you, Chris, and welcome everyone to our debate. I want to thank Chris for that warm introduction, since neither of our featured speakers today went through a metal detector and I'm sitting between them. If you wonder what happens to old City Club presidents, you can see by two of us here we become moderators and parliamentarians, so if you're seeking that office, look forward to those opportunities. Very briefly, I'm going to tell you what the ballot measure says. It's fairly simple and straightforward in my reading. It limits terms for the City of Portland's elected officials, mayor, commissioner, and auditor. Mayor and the auditor are limited to 2 4-year terms. It changes the length of term to city commissioner to 2 years and limits them to 3 2-year terms, or a total of 6 years, if my math is correct. We will have a format as follows. For the first 10 minutes, each side will be offered 5-minute opening statements. Then we'll have approximately 20 minutes for questions from one side to the other and the return. And then we will follow that with questions from you. And if you don't come up with anything good, I've been charged with finding the real nasty things to ask these two poor gentlemen. And then there are 2.5-minute closing statements. And as was already stated, then we will deal with the ballot measure. So with that opening, I will ask Mr. Farago and Mr. MacColl if they would take their own podiums. Mr. Farago will begin with his 5-minute opening statement, followed by Mr. MacColl, and we do have a timekeeper down in front that is going to be ruthless in her watching the time. Mr. Farago.
Thank you, Bill. I think you're going to need a nice detector, not a metal detector, though. I'd like to thank the Board of Governors and the Executive Committee, the Program Committee, the Research Committee, and the audience here and listening throughout Portland on public radio. I joined the City Club when I moved to Portland, and as a member, I really appreciate the forum for public policy discussion that we have here. But especially, I want to thank and congratulate the people of Portland, whose 26,145 signatures placed Measure 2639, Portland term limits, on the ballot. Because without you, we wouldn't be having this discussion today. Back in January, President Clinton said, "The era of big government is over." With these words, our president revealed an awareness of the disconnect between the governed and our government in America. But it's not just the federal government. To many people, elected officials appear to live in a different world, with special privileges and without the accountability that governs our lives. It's a world consumed with political maneuvering, where government grows faster than the rest of the economy, a world ordinary citizens have trouble relating to. Term limits mean only one thing for certain. One thing: predictable open seat elections. That's all. We can look forward regularly to electing new people with new ideas, energy, and focus. More competition means better choices for all of us on Election Day. Whenever given the choice, voters demonstrate their conviction that term limits are a good idea for all levels of government. There is an abundance of Portlanders throughout our communities who have experience and skills we need to draw upon in city government in order to meet the changing needs of Portland. Here in Oregon, we've seen no ill effects from the gubernatorial term limits that date to our state's founding. No ill effects from term limit laws passed by Oregon voters more recently in a dozen localities, including Multnomah County and the cities of Lake Oswego and Tigard. No ill effects from the 1992 measure that extended term limits to all other statewide offices and to the state legislature. Voters passed that measure 2-1 right here in Multnomah County. I know of no term limit law anywhere that has been repealed by Oregon voters or voters anywhere in America. Now, some people don't understand how or why Portland's electorate may find our representative system lacking. Let's discuss it today so that everyone can have a better understanding. I'm prepared to give some examples. Let's discuss if Measure 2639 has the potential to renew citizen confidence in our democracy. I believe it does. And let's discuss the campaign. Political consultants advise opponents of popular initiatives and measures to indulge in confusing speculation. Everyone gets taken up with predicting the future, but let's not do that here today. I'll stick to the track record, because nearly 3,000 cities with 58 million residents across America have term limits. There is plenty of hard evidence to use as support, and no one can accurately predict the future. The bottom line is that the future performance of government anywhere ultimately depends on the people who will be elected, and that will always be true. We have two alternatives in Portland. We can continue to trust only career politicians to lead the way to better government, with elections that discourage participation by citizens who are somehow underexposed to the ways of the special interests that surround our public institutions. Or, with term limits, we can renew Portland's citizen approach to city government, with elections that promise to include Portlanders with problem-solving and leadership skills from outside as well as inside government, to give voters better choices on Election Day and take a first step toward restoration of public confidence in our city's representative system.
Thank you. And now with 5-minute opening statement, Kim MacColl.
Thank you, also. I'll move this over here. This ballot measure 2639 is not applicable to Portland. Promoted as a term limits measure by its proponents, it is a fatally flawed subterfuge created for the taxpayer united group for drastically changing Portland's commission form of government, with which it is incompatible. Its proponents have used the popular call for term limits to hide the true purpose of their efforts. It is a Trojan horse. It is also, as a friend of mine said, a cookie-cutter approach that does not fit our Portland cookie. It would severely damage the foundations of Portland city government, which would experience its most traumatic change in 83 years. By reducing commissioner terms to 2 years, Portlanders would be copying the worst features of congressional government. Do we want to import congressional 2-year term models to City Hall? 2-year terms for commissioners would mean constant campaigning and continual electioneering, which would be very distractive. They would also double candidates' expenditures. Recent campaigns, which have totaled over $800,000, could be expected to rise to over $1 million. Just for the current primary, the 3 candidates for Lindbergh's seat have had to raise over $300,000. You didn't know the seat was worth that much, did you, Mike? All right. A November runoff could double that amount. Under this measure, it is conceivable that we could have 4 new commissioners and a new mayor in 1 year. This is not the way to run a $1 billion a year business operation. It is a recipe for chaos. My opponent arrived in Portland a few years ago with plenty of money to spend and the zeal of an evangelistic convert. He has put at least $35,000 of his own money into this campaign, either directly or through the Taxpayer United Group, much of which paid for the signature gathering. He and his TPU allies know little about the internal workings of Portland government, either its history or its current operation. But they do know the demagogic appeal of term limits as a supposed cure-all for the frustrated, the disaffected, and the uninformed. Now, Portland is a unique city, with the only commission government among large American cities today. It's not a perfect system, certainly, but commission government, as we have known it in recent years, has given Portland one of the highest national ratings for its financial management, its city planning, and transportation. It enjoys a triple A bond rating. As a $1 billion a year operation, it is a huge and complex business, which requires experienced management and a skilled bureaucracy. Because commissioners must be both administrators and policymakers, their dual duties are not commensurate with those of state legislators or metro and county commissioners, all of whom exercise oversight roles, but not hands-on administrative responsibilities. It takes at least a year for a commissioner to become really familiar with assigned bureaus and offices. This measure would automatically guarantee more authority and power to the permanent bureaucracy, and it would also grant to special interests and lobbyists a more influential role. A neophyte commissioner would rely on their biased expertise, as well as on their money for the next campaign. I'm going to cut this short a little bit. I simply want to point out that we do not have corrupt power brokers as implied by the proponent. I have been studying Portland government for close to 50 years, not 30. And I have never seen it in certainly the last 30 years. Commission actions may not always be wise or free of mistakes, but the system is well ventilated by the media. And many of the city's accomplishments have taken years to materialize. Affordable, I won't go into all of them, all of these various programs. But continuity in office is thus crucial. Let's not forget that we already have term limits. Elections, voters should be free to decide every election whether to limit a public official's term based on performance in office. Mayor Katz and Auditor Clark were elected to open seats. Keep that in mind. First-term Commissioner Charles Hales defeated an incumbent. The campaign to fill Commissioner Lindbergh's seat is wide open, and it appears that Commissioner Blumenauer's seat will be soon open. What difference would term limits make in such cases? So I say, what is the point of Ballot Measure 2639? It is irrelevant. Thank you.
The next section of the program, each speaker will ask the other, beginning with Mr. Farago asking a 30-second question of Mr. MacColl. The answerer has a minute and a half in which to respond, which will then be followed by his question. Mr. Farago.
Well, it's 3 short ones, Kim. You gave me a lot there, but maybe we'll get back to that. When I read your voters' pamphlet statements, I couldn't believe it. I called Vicki Irvin. When I read the voters' pamphlet statements that you, the 6 that you paid $1,800 for, I couldn't believe it, and I called Vicki Irvin at Multnomah County, the Director of Elections, and I asked her, is it true, these claims that are being made? Well, she told me about what the Oregonians said, that's ridiculous. There are no additional elections, no additional costs that are more than a half a cent per voter from this measure, and they wouldn't even be borne by the city taxpayers because the county pays for the elections. The first question is, did the GOP consulting firm that you hired for $7,000 do push polling on this question to find out that people might oppose term limits if they were told these falsehoods?
Well, first of all, I think what you said first involved a question, did it or not, in terms of whether we were working with Moore Associates in falsehoods. Our material and some of the material we put out initially incorrectly put costs assumed to be public. We use the term total cost generically. The total costs basically are 90% private by the candidates, even though the public costs will only be insignificant. And that's the point that I have been making, and I don't know if we made that to the poll or not.
Well, you didn't make it in the voters' pamphlet.
Excuse me,
You
Mr.
said that
Farago, the next question goes to Mr. MacColl.
Okay. How can you justify the statement that the public has spoken through 26,000 signatures when paid gatherers received practically all of their money from you, either directly or through the TPU? It seems that money speaks.
Well, Kim, I know that tactic. It's called shoot the messenger. And we've seen it everywhere, and we see it in term limits all the time. People recognize it for what it is. I don't believe that the people of Portland are for sale, and I resent the inference that people were paid to put their signatures on a voluntary petition. That is not true. For better government, that's why we want to put this thing forward. Susan and I chose to live in Portland here. It's a great city because of the people, not because of the unique form of government. That may be okay, but that's not what makes Portland great. And we have a stake here, Kim. We aren't coming into town to change the world. Term limits are sweeping the nation everywhere, and we're just being part of that. Why else would I do this? I don't get paid to do it.
Your next question, Mr. Farago, or is that it?
Let's go.
What'd you say?
That was not my question. Although
All right, do I come
would be a
next?
good one.
You'll answer next.
Getting back to the voters' pamphlet statements again. Before you put those false statements in about doubling the cost to city taxpayers of term limits, to city taxpayers, did you know that these claims were false before you wrote the check for $1,800 to Multnomah County for those pamphlet statements? Did you call like I did, Kim, and find out what the real impact of this measure would be?
Yes, you asking me now?
Yes.
Yes, no, we did not call before we wrote any checks. The information, which I personally did not get involved with, as I said, grouped all the costs as total costs. I have always looked at it, as I say, generically. In other words, both private and public. We should have made the distinction between the public costs, which are minimal, and the private costs, which about over 95%. The costs will double in just having elections every 2 years as opposed to every 4 years. We've already seen what the present costs are, and we can just use a little mathematics there. But that was the use of a term which the newspapers picked it up, and I did my best to disabuse him of it, but it was too late, and they weren't interested in changing it.
And now your question.
Is there a problem with Portland city government that this measure would fix? Please give specific examples of how the present lack of term limits is or is not working for the citizens of Portland. What important city issues are not being addressed?
Well, Kim, I think you said it earlier. You answered my question for me when you pointed out that we have a very competitive open seat election, but we have not very competitive re-election campaigns this year. That's a trend that's beginning to take hold in Portland, and it's a negative trend that has taken place all over the country. We don't want that. We want competitive elections, as is our tradition, and term limits is a way to ensure that. But the problem that we have that's biggest is that our system discourages otherwise qualified candidates from participating in the electoral process. Because unless you're willing to spend a career in politics, you wouldn't dream of putting your name as a candidate, even if you have experience from outside government that lends itself to experience inside government, running a large bureaucracy, a nonprofit. even experience that's gained in the home. And that's the problem that term limits is intended to correct, to open up a closed system. Pardon me?
He's
That's
not
the answer.
asking a question, he's giving his response.
But now it's my turn for a question.
Sure.
Getting back to those voter statements, those voter pamphlet statements, I have one more question on them, and then we'll move off of that. You know, I'm familiar with GOP consultants. One of their favorite tactics is to recommend sending scare mail to senior citizens. Did you follow that advice too, Kim? How much have you spent on campaign advertising, including mailings and radio, that includes the false claims of doubling these election expenses?
I cannot answer that because I've not been directly that involved in writing the checks. I don't believe those are false claims. It's just the way they were stated. But, and I have tried to change that, but I could not get it changed in the press to make that distinction between public and private costs.
Your question.
How would term limits affect city government's ability to create, develop, and bring to competition long-term projects like the waterfront park, the downtown plan, light rail, affordable housing, all of which take a great deal of time? Pioneer Square took 10 years to develop.
Right.
How would term limits of city government ability to create, how would it affect the completion of these long-term government projects?
Well, you know, long-term projects in the city have gone forward despite the sort of turnover that we have that you say is equivalent or adequate for Portland. So the present situation hasn't prevented long-term projects from going forward. And it isn't just the politicians elected to elective office who make projects go forward. Outside groups support most of the major projects. And good ideas have a way of taking on a life of their own. Let me give you a few examples. Mayor Goldschmidt started the light rail project. I understand, of course, as you pointed out, it was before my time here in Portland, but he left office after 2 years. We have light rail, and Neil Goldschmidt is still advising the state on light rail, such as at the special session in Salem. Look at Mayor Katz. In Salem, she was all about education and the Katz plan. Now, as mayor of Portland, she's continuing to work to fund education adequately. These things continue. They don't go away when somebody leaves office. The only change term limits offers here is that no one office holder can become so powerful that he or she alone is single-handedly able to support a project which doesn't enjoy broad public support. And with respect to some other long-term projects, say the East Side on-ramp, for example, it might mean that citizen office holders actually follow the recommendation of citizen study commissions instead of treating them like a useless waste of time.
Your question.
It was Paul's question.
Yes,
Paul.
thank you. Kim, in my experience, term limits opponents are always fond of complaining that it will empower the bureaucracy and unelected interests. But the opposition is usually funded by a who's who of the bureaucracy and special interests. This measure is no different. The Auditor's Campaign Committee is the single largest donor, joining others like the regulated utilities and companies like AT&T, the banks, Pacific Gas Transmissions, and, of course, AFSCME. Does AT&T really care one way or the other about term limits? No. Why are they giving unless it affects their contract with the city? It's an insider deal, no more, no less. They have cozy relationships they don't want disrupted.
Question has to end with a question mark. Have you got a question in there?
The question is, how much more special interest money will you spend in the last week of the campaign beyond what you've already reported in the disclosures as of the 12th? Why not disclose right now who the donors are and how many dollars they're slipping under the door in the last week?
Well, you saw the CE reports, which are not complete. It's only up to the last week or so, and we're going to be raising a lot more money over the next 4 or 5 days because we came into this thing very slowly. You got a very strong head start with Bill Sizemore and his Taxpayers United. It was a sleeper, and it still is a sleeper for many people.
So how much?
Well, we're aiming for about at least 20,000, and I don't know what the total. We're close to that now.
They've outraised us 30 to 28 so far. Now 20 more from special interests.
Paul, let's let Kim finish his answer here.
Yeah, it's not special interests. There are a lot of people who have contributed to this, or will be over the next few days, when if they listen to my speech. But I have not been aware, and I studied Portland government for 40 years, thoroughly. I've served on the Planning Commission. I've been involved in downtown planning, citizen groups, and so forth. And I have not been aware of any special interest receiving any particular favor, particularly in the last 20 years. I could go back into the 1960s and 70s, but not in the last 20 years. I have not seen a case of it, and I follow it probably more closely than anybody else in the city. And I know I have no particular interest to hide. I have no personal interest in the city of Portland, and that financially or otherwise. This is a bogus issue as far as Portland is concerned. It's probably one of the cleanest cities in the country. It may not be the smartest, but...
On that note, time. Are you commissioners listening down there? Do you have another question, Kim?
Do I have another question?
For Mr. Farago.
Yeah. Well, I've already dealt with some of that, so in the special interest in my answer. So I've still not seen any specific examples, Paul, of cozy relationships certainly in the last 15 or 20 years. Sure, people know each other, but I have not seen any under-the-table deals pulled. And I'd like you to cite specific examples, if you would.
Okay, well, let's talk about the auditor's role in this campaign.
The what?
The auditor's role in this campaign.
Okay. I was saving that to the very end, but that's my final comment, but that's all right.
Well, then let's save it for the very end. I'm going to defer to you on that.
No, well, it'll come after you make your question.
Let me ask the question how these contributions get made. I understand it this way. Most people do. The relationships that don't want to be disrupted by the special interests. If you want me to tell you who called who, I can't do that. We all know it doesn't work that way. They get an expression of concern, followed by a letter in the mail that says, wouldn't you contribute to this? And that's the way it works. And these special interests are the same funders that have backed Measure 24, which the City Club has opposed. Isn't that the way it gets done, Kim? Can you explain that to us?
Not anymore. You were thinking in terms of other cities. Your native city of Providence is probably the best example, and that's probably why you're in favor of term limits.
I think I've just lost control here somewhere. What, was that your statement and then right on into the next question, or?
Well, I think...
You have the next question, so I don't want to short your time here.
Okay.
They will have 2.5-minute closing statements. They will be checked for weapons prior to the meeting.
Okay, well, let's go on to the next one.
This will be your last question in this section.
Another common argument put forward by opponents of term limits is that we lose valuable experience in government. But that's just not true. Term limits are a net gain for experience in government. Look at the presidents of the United States who continue to advise after they've left their limited offices. And look at the Goldschmidt example I gave earlier. And look at there are other former commissioners who've gone in to run bureaus and who may come out and run for mayor again. There is no loss. Rather, there is a net gain by bringing new people in and relying on the ex-office holders to continue to contribute their valuable experience in other ways. Why do you insist on continuing to make this experience drain claim that just doesn't square with the track record?
Experience what claim?
Experience drain. By these office holders turning over, we lose their experience. Experience that I say is used in other ways. Why do you make that claim that we lose experience?
Because you're running $1 billion a year business, which requires a very complex operation of people who know what's going on. Would you, as a stockholder in a major corporation, want to see your boards of directors and your top management turned over every 2 to 3 years? Maybe some corporations could use that, but it certainly as a matter of policy, I wouldn't recommend it, nor would your stockholders. You'd be voted out of office. A city is a big business, a very big business. It requires a tremendous amount of skill.
And your last question for Mr. Farago.
If I can. Okay. What evidence do you have that Portland city government exhibits a, quote, voter be damned attitude? Seems to me a perception that is not necessarily true or accurate, but it is often appears to be true.
Well, I think the U.S. Supreme Court agrees with me because earlier this year they struck down the city's long-running
I know, I've heard
scheme
that.
on annexation. What the city's tried to do was say,
Oh, we
here's
know.
a piece of paper, in exchange for your agreeing that you don't get a vote, we'll give you a discount on your service. But where does that bribe come from? Our own tax money. The court said if you can't bribe somebody for a vote, you can't bribe them for a quasi-vote. Now, you know, the city had 10 years in which to answer this problem in compliance with the law before kicking it all the way up to the highest court in the nation at taxpayer expense. That, if that doesn't say to the voters, we don't value your vote, I don't know what does.
Thank you both for that interesting session. And now it's time for those of you in the audience, if you have a question for Mr. Farago or Mr. MacColl, we'll be using about the next 15 minutes for that. If you would come to the microphone and tell us your name and who you're addressing your question to, I will balance the questions between each of them. In other words, one for Mr. Farago and one for Mr. MacColl. We'll start with a question for Mr. Farago and ask you to take only 30 seconds in stating your question, if you would. We'll give a minute and a half to the responder, and if the other person would like to have a minute to respond as well, I'm going to change the format a little bit and offer both speakers an opportunity to respond to a question. Yes, sir. For Mr.
Greg
Farago.
Wood, yes, for Mr. Farago. Greg Wood, City Club member. Isn't our vote the ultimate in term limits?
Well, it is, as long as we have competitive elections. And why bother having an election if it's not competitive? But the present system of career politics says that the order one of business is to protect myself from a competitive election the next time out. And we cannot see to the public interest until we see to that interest first. Well, the people have had enough of that. It's time to reverse the batting order, put the people first and the re-election second. And under term limits, you know, you say that we're going to have lots of people running constantly for re-election. Don't you remember that people in term limits don't run for re-election? That they come in and serve in the manner of public service 2, 4, maybe 6 years and then go out and live under the laws that they pass? That's the way it works. They don't always run for re-election. This is to stop that.
Do you want to respond as well, Kim?
No, I don't think it's worth responding to.
Next question, one for Mr. MacColl, please.
Greg McPherson, City Club member. Is there any reason, in your view, why a less experienced candidate would be more susceptible to the influence of special interests and their campaign contributions than a more experienced city council member?
That a neophyte, a new candidate running would be less, I think, is that what you said, would be less susceptible? I think it'd be more susceptible in many respects, because if you go back to the reason we have commission government and created 4-year terms in 1913 was because the council was being, 2-year terms were continually being picked off by special interests and in the back pocket, so to speak. And you are going to need money. You're going to have to run every 2 years. You're going to be susceptible and vulnerable to interests that you need to support your cause. I would, you know, I don't know if you can make that much of a difference. Everybody is susceptible to some kind of pressure. One thing that money does do, if you give it to a candidate, is to give you access, a certain amount of access to that candidate. But I am not aware of any case where a city council person has changed a vote based on a friendship or pressure or money contributed to his or her campaign. In fact, I've seen just the opposite in some cases. And I have not always agreed with some of the commissioners that I have supported, but that's their job. And I saw the city council totally reverse position when it was considering the first 405 freeway through northwest Portland, when a man came in and gave evidence that it would freeze over every winter. And all 5 members of the commission went from an aye to a no vote when they heard one person from Balch Creek area come up and explain the ice conditions in February with the wind coming down.
Time.
Boy, that took, so that's citizen. That is important.
Thank you.
Let me, at the risk of reminding people of what they already know about the way special interests operate in our political system, most political power that is used to benefit some at the expense of others, and that's what special interest is all about, is accumulated and discharged only by politicians who are insulated from competition and always win re-election or election to another office or some sort of career that they've built through their office. And the process of politicking one's way to the top, term after term after term, is corrupting, plain and simple. We don't need any Dan Rostenkowskis or Bob Packwoods in city government in order to have to deal with this problem later. Let's prevent it now, and term limits ensures that we won't have those problems with the special interests.
Thank you. Another question for Mr. Farago? Yes, sir.
Tom Dunn, member. This is for Mr. Farago for a comment. You stated today that there was a trend for less open seat elections for city positions. I wasn't aware of such a trend. I've looked at the data pretty carefully. Maybe I'm mistaken. Would you comment, please?
Yeah, well, let me give a couple of examples. And you know, I'm not an authority on local election history, but we have a mayor's election for a second term that is considered not competitive. We have a commissioner re-election that's considered not competitive. I mean, even if that commissioner's opponent is from a well-known political family in Portland, I doubt that half of us here could name him. The mayor is proving that you don't even have to run a campaign when you seek re-election. You don't have to campaign hard. Now, around the country, we've seen re-election rates that have accompanied the term limits movement, and let's head it off before it happens here. You know, we don't need to have that experience in order to put in place a system that ensures that we do have competitive elections and that we do have open seat elections, which are always more competitive, as I've given in those examples. And the county commissioner is one other. Dan Saltzman is running for his second term. He has one opponent. When he ran for his first term, there were 6 people running in that race.
Kim, do you want to comment?
Can I comment on that or not?
Yes, for 1 minute.
I don't see any evidence that there is, well, I'd like to know what the correlation here is between competition for office and quality and effective government, quality of service. In other words, if a person's doing a good job in that current, why should there be 10 people that would want to compete, or 5 people, or 3 people? The city of Portland has this reputation, which I think is deserved. And if it has people in office who are working well, why should somebody want to run against that? And also, I have run into people who said that if I can only run for 2 years or 4 years, I don't want to leave my job or leave my profession just for that very brief period of time. You know, it works both ways, Paul.
A question for Mr. MacColl. Oh, come on, Fran, you can do it.
Francis Storrs, City Club member. May the question be addressed to both of them? Or?
So they'll both have an opportunity to answer.
I asked whether or not either of your positions are identified with a particular political party or particular political philosophy.
Well, certainly my position isn't. I don't know.
Pardon?
Oh, I think well, you mean you were asking me to identify what?
Your position
Does the
on the
position that you hold on term limits, is that synonymous with the philosophy of any particular political party?
No, no.
The same with
Well,
Mr. Farago?
I think obviously the people who have been in office for a long time would be opposed to it. But I go back in my history, at least, to an academic, going back to Princeton, where I worked with the Woodrow Wilson scholars and people all the way up through my doctorate in this field in constitutional history. And it's not a party thing, although the progressive elements in our society have generally opposed. I don't know any literature on this subject academically except a few pieces that have been written in the last few years, particularly relating to municipal government, and nothing relating to commission government. Commission government is not like the other cities. You're either going to change it or we've got to live with it.
Paul?
Well, one of the remarkable things about this issue of term limits is that it cuts across all political and demographic lines. CBS polling ex-director Neil Pilson called it the most remarkable issue he's ever seen in that respect. 65 to 70% of people consistently vote for term limits. And you can't find that in any partisan breakdown. I mean, no party gets 65 to 70% the way term limits does. So people who disagree on other things agree on term limits. But I will say that term limits does present a starkly different view than no term limits. It's the difference between an open society, an open political process, and a closed political process. Term limits opens the political process to participation by anybody who meets the basic qualifications in the Charter. No term limits means that if you don't have government experience, prior government experience, you needn't even bother. You can read it through the endorsements in the Oregonian, and you can find it evidenced at every other place. And it's very discouraging to people across the spectrum, whether they gain their experience in families and home settings, or in the workplace, or in the volunteer sector. It's very discouraging to them that that experience is not valued equally with the experience inside government. And maybe that's one of the reasons why there's this disconnect between people and their government. And it can best be solved by opening it up, making people feel a bit more of a part of it.
Thank you. Question for Mr. Farago.
Steve Moskowitz, City Club member. Hi, Paul.
Steve.
My question is not so much about limiting the number of terms that a city commissioner would have, but shortening a term from 4 years to 2 years. And I appreciate your stated goals of wanting to increase democracy and open up politics, but why won't that aspect of your proposal actually have the opposite effect by shifting power from elected officials to the bureaucracy to manage city services, and by actually increasing the influence of money, since those who are in office will be spending 6 months out of a 2-year term rather than 6 months out of a 4-year term trying to raise money?
Well, the big problems with 2-year terms only cropped up in our history, nationally or in the state, and those are the terms from our constitutional founding for representatives in Salem and in Congress. The big problem has come in when the professional politicians have come up. Those 2-year terms were fine until people started spending too much time in Washington. We're fond of joking that it coincides with the advent of air conditioning in Washington, D.C. But what the problem with that the 2-year terms solve is again, bringing people into the process. 2-year terms mean more people can serve. The track record is that people come in and serve temporarily, and that they don't work up these relationships with the bureaucracy that are developed over long periods of time. It's a citizen approach to government, and it's traditional with Portland's citizen-style approach to government in general.
Kim, do you have a comment?
Well, gosh. No, I think I've already made my point on this.
One last question for Mr. MacColl.
Okay, Andrew Wheeler, member. Mr. MacColl, you indicated that perhaps this term limit idea is a Trojan horse. Why did you say that? How do you mean that?
Because the people behind this have a very different concept of government than I personally do, and most of my friends. They look upon government in a sort of passive way to provide just the basic protection of order, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I feel that government has a positive role to play. Some people call this intrusive, but it a little bit depends on whose ox is being gored. And all the problems we've got in our society today, government has to play a role, but in conjunction with, and we have a long history of partnership with private interests and private business, and interest in the best sense of the word, not some nefarious sense. So it's, I think that what these people are doing is using a popular issue to wreck Portland government as it currently exists, without saying so. And that's the Trojan horse. The troops are inside the horse, and they're about to come out if this ballot measure succeeds. And I would venture to guarantee that if it does, you will hear the biggest, loudest explosion when people finally realize what has happened to government. And we'll probably have another initiative measure to rescind the action, because people are sleeping on this one, because we haven't had the funds.
Time. Paul?
Well, I haven't heard anything like that here today. I don't think I've said anything like that. You know, Kim, people are entitled to the kind of government they want. We have a system of self-government in this country. and in the state and in the city. It is up to the people, this form of government, the style of government that we want. If the people revive this initiative process, it's lain dormant in citywide for 12 years or more. Maybe it's been abused statewide, but this is the first initiative to make the ballot in over a decade. 26,145 voters. Now, these aren't Trojan warriors. These aren't people out to wreck the government. You can't find signatures to do that, Kim. People have a good government approach in Portland, and that's what term limits are about. And, you know, this stuff just isn't worthy of this kind of discussion. I mean, the term limits that we're offering are identical to what we have in Salem for our executive and legislature, identical to what we have for our Salem representatives, the 2-year terms. We can live with that. We live with it everywhere else.
Time. We'll now go into the final closing, 2.5 minutes to each side. Paul Farago will speak first. Kim will speak second. Again, 2.5 minutes, gentlemen. Go ahead, Paul.
Term limits are about renewing Portland's traditional approach to citizen involvement in city government. The opposition, funded by the special interests, argues that we don't need it, that things are fine the way they are. I've argued that we can count on the people of Portland to step up and pitch in solving our city's problems if we only remove barriers to participation. I've argued that we can do that by ending the system's bias that favors those who want to make a career out of public service. Let's include people who regard public service as a 2, 4, or 6-year commitment, who intend to return to live as citizens under the laws that they pass. Now, this theory of rotation is not mine. It's as old as democracy itself. Aristotle wrote, "A principle of liberty is to rule and be ruled in turn." Benjamin Franklin refined it when he said, "In free governments, the rulers are the servants, and the people their superiors and sovereigns. For the former, therefore, to return among the latter is not to degrade, but to promote them." Kim, thank you for bringing your vast experience of knowledge of Portland city government to this discussion, and for your commitment to good government for our city. Along with most Portlanders, I share that commitment to good government. I think this campaign has proven to doubters that Measure 2639, Portland term limits, is presented by the people of Portland in the spirit of good government and better government. Term limits in Oregon and most everywhere else are a consensus issue. The consensus is, among voters, that term limits are a good idea. And it's no secret that most politicians are opposed to term limits, and the professionals are persuasive. That's why Measure 2639 was placed on the ballot by the people. It took 26,000 plus signatures to give all of us a chance to vote on city term limits in a textbook use, proper use of the initiative process. Because when the government won't propose a law that the people want, then the people can propose that law themselves. The initiative is the only way to get term limits. And remember, the special interest dollars opposed to Measure 2639 come from the same sources in favor of restricting the statewide initiative process under Measure 24, which the City Club opposes. It would be consistent to oppose the same special interests attempting to restrict citizens' participation in city elections by voting yes on Portland term limits. On Tuesday, in true democratic fashion, Portland voters have an opportunity to open up our system to more competition for elective offices and better choices on Election Day. As Chief Petitioner, I'm proud to have been able to work within the initiative process that we value so much. And I trust voters, all of us here listening on radio and throughout our city, to make the right choice based on our best judgment. I've enjoyed the opportunity to present the case for city term limits and will respect the voters' decision on Tuesday.
Respect your moderator, would you?
Thank you for your kindness and your attention.
Thank you. You get an extra 15 seconds, Kim.
Before starting my closing remarks, I would like to remind Paul again that Portland is not an Athenian democracy of 30,000 people. It's a very complex system. I would also like to say, I'm glad he said that he was the chief proponent. He is also the chief funder. And if my figures are correct from the auditor's office this morning, he's put in about $30-some thousand into this campaign of his own money, either him directly or through the Taxpayers United. So again, we're talking about what is popular, what is not. I think money speaks. But I want to say a few words about the city auditor's office, which has received scant attention in the 2639 debate. Of all the elected city offices, that of the auditor is probably the most important, technically speaking. It certainly requires the most professional experience. In addition to performing audits, the auditor is the custodian of city records. Before Jewel Lansing's incumbency in 1983, the auditor's was a political office which often occupied by well-connected City Hall insiders. With Lansing, the city established the first of 3 professional requirements for the job. The person must now hold at least one of 3 credentials: CPA, CMA for management, or a CIA for internal. In her 8 years, Auditor Barbara Clark has brought the office to an equally high level of accomplishment, expanding Lansing's performance audit, not always appreciated by the council members under whose authority these offices function. For a really experienced auditor, the salary is considerably lower than what could be expected in the private practice. It is a job requiring the highest degree of integrity, dedication, and professionalism. Limiting such a person to 8 years seems ridiculous, if not wasteful and inefficient. The auditor is forbidden to run for any other city office while serving as auditor, and I think that's a very important point. Finally, I'd like to quote from the Oregonian's editorial. How much time do I have left, Madam? 30 seconds. Well, it doesn't give me much, does it? What the Oregonian has suggested, to go about it the right way, to create a charter review commission to study alternatives and make careful, comprehensive recommendations, and one of which could be term limits. This is the way we've always done it, through a commission which takes time to put all the pieces together. You just don't deal with one element. Ballot Measure 3629 would create a disaster waiting to happen. I urge all to go out into the community and pass the word. Our campaign has not had the funds to run the radio ads in the manner of my opponent. So I would suggest vote no on 2639. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank both of our debaters, if you would, for... And you guys can now sit down, but not too close to me, the way you were going at it there. Nobody can say a city club debate is not lively. Unfortunately, it's my duty now to report to the club that we do not have a quorum and will be unable to vote on the report as presented. I would ask your indulgence, however, in inviting B.J. Seymour, who is the chair of the committee, to come up and present the information that they did come from their report, but we will not be voting, Charlie, on the report, unfortunately, because we did not reach our required bylaw number of 75 members present. B.J.?
I do find it unfortunate that the members of the club didn't turn out in sufficient numbers to have a club vote on this issue, because our committee thinks it's an important one. Before I discuss the issue, however, I would like to thank the members of my committee, all of whom are here, and I'll read their names in alphabetical order, because I can't put them in alphabetical order as I think about them. I tend to put them in the order they're sitting. Libby Barber, Tom Dunn, Barnes Ellis, Jay Formick, David Frank, and Chris Steinbrecher. I also would like to thank, in his absence, City Club Research Director Paul Leisner, and to acknowledge Alan Oliver, who was the most unintrusive research advisor I've ever had on any City Club committee I've served on. Now to the report itself. When I agreed to chair this committee, I had the notion this was going to be a pretty simple issue, because, after all, the City Club had taken a position on term limits in 1992, only 4 years ago, and I felt it was just a matter of the proponents of the measure showing why things should be different on the city level. As we investigated this issue as a committee, I learned a lot, because what I learned was that city government is different from other Oregon governments precisely in the ways that have been pointed out in the earlier discussion today. Namely, because city commissioners are both administrators and legislators, it isn't as simple as just setting term limits and bringing in an inexperienced, caring citizen to run a city bureau or a series of city bureaus, as is the responsibility of city commissioners. We didn't find that it was as simple as the proponents of the measure have implied. We found that running city bureaus does take experience. I don't know of any corporation that would bring in an inexperienced individual, however caring and sincere, to run a large company. One of the things we learned as a committee was that the city, in terms of administering its activities, is like a large corporation, and people need experience to do this. A couple of points from the discussion. Mr. Farago says there have been no ill effects of term limits on the governorship, which has had term limits from the beginning. But the limits in the state constitution are only on consecutive terms. The governor can run again if he's been out of office for 4 years. This measure would bar people permanently once they had served their maximum term. Moreover, the proponent says the present system discourages otherwise qualified citizens from running. Our committee found just the opposite. Witnesses suggested to us that qualified people would be reluctant to leave presumably secure jobs for time-limited positions, especially for those lasting only 2 years, and then having to raise money once again to run for another 2 years and still another 2 years after that. Moreover, Mr. Farago said, and I'm quoting here, I believe, people are entitled to the kind of government they want. I hope I'm accurate, Paul. We agree. And for that reason, we feel this measure deprives voters of the opportunity to vote for candidates of their choice when those candidates have reached their limits in office but have not run out of ability to function effectively. Specifically, you have the report of our committee before you. We concluded that the measure would attempt to solve a problem that we don't believe exists. Voters have defeated several incumbents in recent years, so you don't have to have non-incumbents running in order to have an open election. Moreover, we think, as I've stated, the proposal would be inefficient in terms of Portland's unique commission form of government, would make it difficult for an elected official to learn the job well enough to make desired or necessary changes and then have a record on which to be judged, would make many large urban projects which take years to complete more difficult, would increase elected officials' reliance on lobbyists for information. I've been a lobbyist. I know that you do provide information to elected officials, and they need that information, but you don't want them to be totally dependent on you, even if you are a lobbyist. Would transfer power to longer-serving, non-elected bureaucratic officials by allowing them to wait out terms until somebody more favorable to their point of view got into office, and moved, therefore, government control farther from the people. Would cause incumbents to spend a larger proportion of their time in office raising money and campaigning, and would, as I said earlier, restrict voter choice by preventing certain incumbents from seeking re-election regardless of their effectiveness. Madam Chairman, I move the club's adoption of this report, although I realize we aren't in a position to take a vote. Thank you.
Thank you for the motion and the second. It's out of order since we don't have a quorum, unfortunately. I want to thank BJ and her committee for their excellent work. I want to apologize to them, frankly, as a member of City Club, that we didn't get 75 members. As a former president, I'm a bit embarrassed and hope that the board will take a look at how to solve this kind of a problem. I would urge everyone in the room to go out and use your right to vote, no matter how you feel about this issue or any other issue, and hope that you will join us back here next week for our panel discussion on the results of the elections. We are adjourned.
You got through it. Yeah.